Mr. President, when the government shuts its doors, public attention often falls on our national parks. This should be surprising to no one. Year after year, whenever anyone does a survey to discover the most popular and least popular parts of the federal government, the answers tend to be the same. As I recall, the least popular parts often focus on the IRS for understandable reasons. For similarly understandable reasons, the most popular parts involve our national parks system. And so when the government shuts down, a lot of attention turns to them, as it should. The stark closed sign that barricades the entrance to our cherished parks is more than just a sign in those circumstances where it arises during a shutdown. It's a palpable consequence of a government bereft of funds and a dysfunctional process in Congress that leads to that moment. This issue is close to the hearts of a lot of people in a lot of parts of the country, but it's especially close to the hearts of the people in my home state of Utah. Every state in this great union, especially every state that's fortunate enough to be home to one or more of our nation's national parks, has to deal with some of these issues in one way or another. Now, to be clear, I abhor the notion of government shutdowns. They are neither my wish nor my aspiration. However, as the close of FY 2023 approaches, a government shutdown looms very large on our horizon. Utah, like many states, finds its identity intertwined with its magnificent landscapes and national parks. Zion, Bryce Canyon, Arches, Canyonlands, Capitol Reef, these are not just names on a map. They're proud symbols of our state, and local communities in many parts of Utah depend on them and depend on the traffic that comes in and out of those national parks. Visiting these parks isn't just about tourism. It's about livelihoods, our families, and our economic lifeblood. The grim reality is that our communities will bear the brunt of these parks closing, if in fact they close their gates due to a shutdown, with no means to recuperate the loss. With just 2 days left, my frustration mounts, knowing the Department of Interior has not updated its shutdown contingency plan for national parks since 2017. How can the Biden administration expect our communities to prepare without a blueprint for such eventualities? In my recent communication with Secretary Haaland, I've emphasized that numerous tools lie at her disposal to keep our parks functioning, even during a shutdown. Using the Federal Lands Recreation Enhancement Act, or FLREA as it's known, to harness non-appropriated fee revenues for essential park operations is a clear path and one that should be pursued here. After all, these very same funds ensured many parks remained open during the December 2018 to January 2019 shutdown. The Department of Interior should also designate as essential as many park and land management employees as possible. Yet, it seems Interior would instead echo past mistakes, like those made in 2013 under the Obama administration, bending to radical environmental pressures and closing our parks under the pretense of quote-unquote resource conservation. This is not just unfortunate, it's inexcusable. In fact, it's deplorable, and it's completely avoidable. Because of such actions, several states, including Utah, were forced to dig into their own pockets to ensure their parks remained open in 2013. But when the shutdown concluded, there was no repayment. States like Utah, New York, Tennessee, South Dakota, Colorado, and Arizona were left holding the bill. Utah alone spent $1.6 million to keep our parks operational for just about a week. Now, look, $1.6 million might seem like a drop in the bucket in the vast sea of overall federal spending. But for states like Utah, with a lot less money running through the state government than runs through our government every single year, and where our elected officials value prudent financial management to help keep their own citizens in a good position. Every single dollar matters. And so this is not something that we should foist upon the states. Look, we know at the outset that people are going to continue to visit national parks. There's no legitimate reason, knowing that they are the single most popular feature of the federal government, arbitrarily to decide at the outset that we're going to close those. In many instances, they had to erect barriers to keep people out, which is sort of the opposite of what you would expect to occur during a shutdown. So let's keep them open. We know in any event that any furloughed staff within the Park Service will be repaid along with the rest of government workers once a shutdown ends. Knowing that as we do, and knowing that these states and their communities are so dependent, as they are, on revenue related to visitors going to national parks, and that those states, being that dependent, are going to cover the tab, the federal government shouldn't be in the position of riding on these states' generosity, on their dependence on the national parks, simply by saying, yeah, you know what, we're going to furlough these workers, allow it to shut down, allow the states to run the parks at great expense to those states, and then not pay them back. No, Mr. President, this is unacceptable. This is a pretty unique circumstance in which the risk of a free rider action calls out for precautionary action on our part. So, Mr. President, my bill on this subject is very simple. It just mandates that the Secretary of the Interior must repay states that spend their own funds to maintain national parks in the event of a shutdown. It's about responsibility, accountability, and most importantly, doing what's right. Our national parks must remain open, not just for the enjoyment of our citizens, but for the survival of the communities that are near them and whose economies revolve around them. To that end, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of S. 2972, which is at the desk. Further, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
I reserve.
Mr. President.
The objection is heard. No. Oh, the senator from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, reserving the right to object, I share my colleagues' concern about making sure our national parks stay open. In fact, I don't want any federal facilities to close their doors, any federal workers to miss a paycheck, or any programs families rely on be undermined by a completely unnecessary shutdown, which is why I am working around the clock to make sure we do pass this bipartisan CR package, which we released yesterday. So I hope the senior senator from Utah will reconsider his recent vote against moving forward on that CR and start working with us to get this straightforward CR across the finish line so we can avoid this shutdown and get back to passing our 12 bipartisan appropriations bills, because that is the only serious solution here. That is the best way to make sure families are able to keep enjoying our national parks, park rangers, and all of our public servants can do the work the American people are counting on and get the paycheck they deserve. There are a lot of programs that we all care about that would be hurt by a shutdown. So we're not going to solve this problem one by one, carve out by carve out, and as I said earlier, you don't stop a flood one drop at a time, you build a dam. We have got a straightforward bipartisan CR package to avoid a shutdown and keep our national parks open. Let's get our jobs done and get that passed, so I object.
Mr. President.
The objection is heard. The senator from Utah.
Mr. President, I'm disappointed that we weren't able to get this done today. It's hard for me to conceive of a legitimate reason sounding in public policy why we wouldn't want to make sure that we hold harmless those states, bold enough, brave enough, conscientious enough to protect their own citizenry and accessibility to national parks within their boundaries. There are a lot of blessings that come from having these mighty 5 national parks in the state of Utah. I love each and every one of them. I can tell you things about every one of them that are unique and that I love. We're always told how lucky we are, and we indeed are, to have these beautiful features in our state and to have national parks. But it's insulting to the citizens of a state when the federal government owns 2/3 of the landmass in our state. Most of that landmass is, of course, not national park land. Most of it doesn't even look like national park land. Most of it is not terribly remarkable one way or another. When you add up all that land, and it's 67% of the state of Utah, that means we can't tax that land. That means we can't access that land, except with a massive mother may I from the federal government, which is very often far too difficult to get. Because we can't collect property taxes on that land because of its federal ownership, that impoverishes our schools, impairing our ability to fund everything from first responders, search and rescue, ambulance services, schools, you name it, it's hard for us to fund. There are counties in the state of Utah where the federal government owns 90+% of the land. This makes it almost impossible for us to operate. To add to all this, Mr. President, to add to all of this by saying, oh, by the way, during a government shutdown, we're going to shut down the single most popular feature of the federal government, the only part the American people really like right now, just because we can, and then we're going to pay our own employees to not work for however many days or weeks the government remains shut down. And sure, we'll let you run all of that, states, if you're concerned about it, if your economy and your people depend on it. But even though we'll pay back our own employees, we're not going to pay back you. This is wrong. And if this is how they're going to treat us, we need to have a really long, hard, overdue discussion about the question, how much land should the federal government own in any particular state? At the time of statehood, there was an understanding made at least implicitly, if not explicitly, in Utah's Enabling Act. Consistent with language inserted into the Enabling Acts of nearly every state added into the Union since the Louisiana Purchase, it was our understanding that we, too, would have this opportunity to have unincorporated federal land within our state boundaries eventually sold. Most of it would be sold if it were not dedicated to another federal purpose. And with the sale of that land would come a percentage that would flow into a trust fund dedicated for the benefit of the state's public education system. That language, inserted into the enabling legislation of nearly every state, added since the Louisiana Purchase, has been honored, was honored throughout the Southeast, throughout the Midwest. But they stopped honoring it when they got to the Rocky Mountains. I'm not sure exactly why. This is exactly the kind of reason why we need to have this discussion. We're told that we can't tax that land, that impoverishes us, that causes all kinds of other problems. They try to offset that through a program called PILT, Payment in Lieu of Taxes. They give the counties, the taxing jurisdictions, pennies on every dollar for what they would otherwise get. But the lost tax revenue is just the beginning of the problem if we're looking at property taxes. It's not just the lost tax revenue from what they would get for taxing that land at the lowest greenbelt rate. It's the lost economic activity that could and would otherwise apply there if they didn't own so much land. Look, think about this for a minute. If any private employer, individual, or corporation owned more than, 5 or 10% of the landmass in your state, people would get nervous, and understandably, justifiably so. We understandably fear the excessive accumulation of power, whether it's economic or political, in the hands of the few. Somebody who owns that much of any state's land has the ability to determine that state's destiny. It gets even worse if that landowner is not a corporation or a nonprofit or an individual or a family, but instead a sovereign government that declares itself exempt from taxation and disallows the people from doing anything on that land without its permission, growing more penurious by the day in who they allow onto the land and to do what. This conversation, Mr. President, is long overdue. And it's situations like this where the senator from Washington tragically was unwilling even to allow these tiny crumbs to drop from the table of the large federal trough. This is wrong. Her arguments are indefensible, suggesting that somehow anyone who doesn't vote for this continuing resolution, negotiated in secret by exactly 2 senators, that she knows darn well can't pass, otherwise they'd be passing it right away. It can't pass because it's got deep flaws in it. For her to blame those few of us who voted against it because of those serious problems and the way it was written and the fact that we're now being told that the leaders filling the tree which means that we're not going to have any effective opportunity even to amend the bill. This is the same bill that was released to us about 30 minutes before we were called to vote on it. About 80 pages of dense reading material that includes countless cross-references. Takes at least, 48 hours, even with trained staff who are trained to look for these things to really understand what's in them. Shame on all of us if we think this is a legitimate process, and shame on this institution if it thinks it's okay to treat Western states, where most of the land is federal, this badly. I'll be back. Thank you.